Okay, so at the end of the previous section, I mentioned that there are a variety of sources of evidence that one might have for the truth or falsity of sentences that might serve as premises of arguments. So I talked about self-evidence, direct empirical evidence, surveys, observation, experiments, and so on. Then testimony, and then further arguments. We might believe a premise on the grounds of a still further argument that has that premise as its conclusion. Now I'm going to focus in this section on testimony because it's a particularly interesting and potentially problematic source of evidence. I mentioned that often evidence that we have on the basis of testimony is evidence that in principle we might have acquired in some other way. So I might take the word of a mathematician for the truth of some complex mathematical principle, even though maybe in theory I could have calculated it myself, so that maybe in theory it could have been self-evident to me. Likewise, empirical matters, I haven't done any direct empirical work to try and figure out how many people there are on Earth. Rather, I tend to take the word of information that's written in encyclopedias and so on, and hope that they're written by suitable experts, people who have conducted the relevant population analyses and surveys. And likewise with the length of the Murray River, again, I haven't measured it, but take the word of people who presumably have. Now, what you might notice is that really a very large proportion of your knowledge is based upon testimony. And there's kind of a reason for that, right? So it's very difficult and time-consuming often to know things on the basis of direct empirical evidence. And we can't really hope to, each individually, acquire massive amounts of knowledge on the basis of doing all the scientific experimental work ourselves. So, someone might devote an entire career to analysing the size of the population on Earth, which leaves them short on time to do experiments and conduct surveys of other matters. So rather, what has happened really is, as a species, humans have, between them, acquired a really great deal of knowledge and evidence, and this is communicated via testimony from one person to another, so that each of us individually ends up with maybe a lot more knowledge, a lot more evidence than we could hope to acquire by operating alone. So testimony is pretty interesting. It's a pretty ubiquitous source of knowledge, but it's also one that presents its own challenges, and we should be interested in under what circumstances we can trust the evidence that we have on the basis of testimony. So there are three questions that seem pertinent here that I'm going to focus on in the remainder of this section. And one is, when we're considering our testimonial evidence, we might ask, is the source, the person that's giving the testimony, an expert? A second one is, does the source have any reason to mislead us? A third one is, are there other independent sources that corroborate the testimony of this one source? And these are all relevant considerations when thinking about how much we can trust the testimonial evidence that we have. So let's go through them in turn. So, is the source an expert? Well, well, it seems better to trust experts than non-experts, so I feel like I could reasonably have more confidence in the pronouncements of an expert than some random person that I met in the pub. So that seems, like a reasonable principle. But one thing that's worth bearing in mind is that expertise is relative to a subject matter, right? So there aren't many people who are just experts in everything, right? And there aren't many people who are experts in nothing. So many of us have areas of expertise and areas of non-expertise. And so probably what we want to do is to take seriously the pronouncements of someone who's an expert in an area. We want to take seriously the pronouncements that they make about that area, but maybe not about other areas or other subject matters. So, for instance, it's reasonable to trust a meteorologist when they give us their verdict about whether it's going to rain tomorrow, but it might not be reasonable to trust what they say about who will win the Super Bowl, right? So, I know they're a meteorologist, so I know they're an expert in weather, but yeah, I don't know that they're an expert in American football. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But if I don't know that they're an expert, or maybe even I know that they're not an expert, then I don't want to trust them about the Super Bowl. But I do still want to trust them about the weather. I want to generally trust people within the domain of their expertise. That makes sense. A second consideration is whether the source has any reason to mislead us. So it might be that a source is an expert about a subject matter, but nevertheless they have reason to mislead us about that subject matter. And then we probably don't want to trust them, even in spite of their expertise. So the example I have on the slide, we might have a scientist who, has a PhD in climatology, has a lot of expertise about the climate, but they're employed, or their research is funded by an oil company, right? So then there's a question about whether we should trust this scientist when they give a pronouncement on whether burning fossil fuels causes climate change, right? So they are an expert in the subject matter. They have all the relevant training. But we might nevertheless think that they might have a reason to mislead us, namely that their funding is dependent upon a company that has an economic interest maybe in denying man-made climate change. So that might give us grounds to be skeptical about this scientist's pronouncement. Similarly, reporters, journalists, might have eyewitness access to global events that we don't have direct access to. So other things being equal, we might like to trust their judgment, trust what they write about those global events. But on the other hand, if we think that the journalist has a political axe to grind, then we might take those reports with a pinch of salt. We might be somewhat skeptical about what they say, whether they've reported things accurately, and whether they've given us the whole picture, or whether that's been influenced by their political views. Now, I suppose also, even if the source doesn't have any obvious reason for misleading us and maybe doesn't deliberately mislead us, we might wonder about their reliability. So maybe there are other reasons for doubting the reliability of a source. So, maybe an extreme example, we might wonder about whether we should trust the eyewitness statement of someone known to take hallucinogenic drugs. That might be an extreme example. So you might think, well, the fact that they take hallucinogenic drugs might render their eyewitness accounts less reliable than someone who doesn't. But I mean, maybe there are sort of other more moderate forms of unreliability. So, for instance, I think we all know people who are prone to exaggeration, for instance, and that might lead us to be a little bit skeptical about their testimony on certain matters. And a final consideration is whether other independent sources corroborate our first source. So, in a sense, this might be a sort of corrective against the sorts of worries that we have about reliability of sources of testimony. So, ideally, ideally we'd like to believe things maybe not just on the basis of the testimony of one person, even one expert, but we might think it's better if we have multiple experts all telling us the same thing. Then that might increase our confidence that what they're telling us is genuinely true. Now, one point here is that having testimony from multiple sources, even multiple experts, is going to be better normally if there's some degree of independence between those experts. So there are kind of various reasons for that. So obviously, if we thought about 10 scientists telling us their views on human-caused climate change, but all of them work for the same oil company, or all of them have their research funded by the same oil company, there's a sense in which their pronouncements are not kind of independent of one another, as they're both subject to the same sorts of biases potentially. And so it's not as good as if we had 10 scientists all who were funded in various different ways, maybe coming from different laboratories and so on. Another reason, so independence might be a helpful corrective against bias, and maybe relatedly. We like independence because independence might be associated with different methodologies of arriving at the same verdict, right? So suppose that I'm interested in how many children William Shakespeare had. It might be good to have multiple experts telling me that he has 3 children. But what I'd really like is some independence between these experts, especially in the following sense. It'd be really nice if these experts had arrived at their verdict about the number of children he had via separate methodologies, right? So, for instance, a good case would be if one of these experts had consulted the birth records at Shakespeare's local parish to arrive at the verdict that he has 3 children, and another had arrived at the verdict that he had 3 children by studying Shakespeare's diaries and his correspondence. So that would sort of be better than if they'd both arrived at the verdict of 3 children by the same means. So if they'd both just looked at the birth records at the parish, then that wouldn't be as good as the case in which one's looked at the birth records and one's looked at his diaries and correspondence. And that's because, in a sense, having those independent methods serves to potentially correct problems or as a sort of counterbalance to potential problems with any one methodology, right? So relying on one methodology, it could be that the method is flawed, right? So it might be that the birth records at his local parish, okay, they'll show children born within that parish, but what if he had a child outside of the parish? Then it might not be recorded there. So we might think that, well, if he had, then hopefully that would have been captured by his diaries and correspondence. So we have a sort of second methodology that acts as a check on our first method. So as well as having multiple sources, it's particularly compelling if we have multiple independent sources. So these are a few of the things that one probably wants to think about when evaluating one's testimonial evidence. And as I say, testimonial evidence is a large part of our evidence for a great number of the things that we take ourselves to know. So first, is the person an expert with respect to the subject matter? Second, do they have any reason to deceive us, or is there any other reason that they might be unreliable? And thirdly, do we have multiple sources of testimony for the same fact? And are those sources of testimony independent? So, if we've got independent expert authorities telling us things, and we think that they have no reason to deceive us and are for no reason unreliable, then this seems like a case where we might have excellent reason to believe what they're telling us. Okay, so that's it for this section.